Good day, everyone, and welcome to another Live with Kevin on a Monday. I say good day because I don't know where you're located. It's noon my time, and I'm glad that you're here. So if you're here with us live, I hope that you will start by saying hello and telling us where you're from using the comments ability on whatever social platform you happen to be on, whether it's YouTube or wherever you are, LinkedIn, Facebook, etc. I hope that you will just tell us where you're from. Say hello. And while you're here, I want you to imagine that you're joining my guest and I for a conversation around the table. And if you were with us around a table, you would ask your questions, you would share your comments, you would include your ideas, and I hope that you will do that here, because if you do, we'll have a better conversation. It will be more valuable for you, and eventually it'll make for a better podcast episode. Yes, if you didn't notice up there in the top corner where it says the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, this will eventually, in early August, be an episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. So now that I've welcomed you as a live audience, what I'm going to do is a countdown, which is where we will trim both the audio and the video for the podcast. So Marissa, this is for you. In 3, 2, 1. Can we as organizations create good jobs with higher pay, meaning, and value and still get great financial results? The answer is yes. Yes, and our guest today is bringing the research to prove it. More importantly, we'll talk about how to change the mindset and culture and create those good jobs. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, where we are helping leaders grow personally and professionally to lead more effectively and make a bigger positive difference for their teams, organizations, and the world. If you are listening to this podcast, you could have been with us live. And so for future episodes, if you want to do that from your favorite social channel, you just need to get connected with us so that you can. And so all you need to do is join our Facebook or LinkedIn groups to join us on those channels and know where and when we'll be going live. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn to do that. Today's episode is brought to you by our new book, The Long Distance Team, Designing a Team for Everyone's Success. You can learn more at longdistanceteambook.com, where you can get an excerpt, learn more, and get a link to purchase your copy at longdistanceteambook.com. Our guest today, let me bring her in before I do that, before I formally introduce her. Her name is Zeynep. She is a professor in operations management at MIT Sloan School of Management. She's also the president of the nonprofit Good Jobs Institute, where she works with companies to improve their operations in a way that satisfies employees, customers, and investors alike. Before joining MIT Sloan, she spent 7 years on the faculty at the Harvard Business School. She's the author of The Good Jobs Strategy, How the Smartest Companies Invest in Employees to Lower Costs and Boost Profits, and her latest book, The Case for Good Jobs, How Great Companies Bring Dignity, Pay, and Meaning to Everyone's Work. She is our guest. I'm pleased to have her. Welcome. I'm glad to have you.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you.
So good jobs. I think everyone's going to vote for them. All those in favor of good jobs say yes, at least when we're talking about for ourselves. But I want to find out, like, you didn't wake up when you were 10 and say, I'm going to be an advocate for good jobs. And so my question would be, how did you kind of come to this? How did this become your work? What led you to this work?
Yeah, I didn't wake up to be a good jobs person, and I didn't wake up to be a jobs person. You know, I studied industrial engineering, and then I went to Harvard Business School for my doctorate, and I'm in the operations management group, and my early research was in retail supply chains. And, you know, supply chain management is about getting the right product to the right place at the right time. But early on in my research, and it's mostly focused on analytical techniques, optimization. And early on in my research, my colleagues and I found that a lot of supply chain problems happened in the last 10 years of the supply chain, which is retail stores. There were so many operational problems, like products were in the wrong place. The data, inventory data were inaccurate. So many of the plans that were planned were not executed. And when I looked into why do these problems happen all the time, and by the way, Kevin, these problems were very expensive, led to lost sales, lower profits. That's where I met the people side of operations, because I found that stores that have more employee turnover had more problems. Stores that were more understaffed had more problems. Stores that had people who didn't know what they were doing because they weren't trained, it wasn't the right people to begin with, had more problems. And most companies were operating in a vicious cycle of low pay, high turnover, loss of operational performance, and poor overall performance. And
So
that's
let me just stop you right there. I'm just going to stop you right there because, or pause you, I guess. I'm not really supposed to stop you, and say that those three things that you just said, any of us, if we early, like, they're common sense, right? Like, okay, if people aren't trained, it's not going to go well. If we don't have enough people on the floor in the retail store, it's probably not going to go well. Like, so one of the things that's fascinating about this is certainly you have all sorts of research to say this is exactly true. And yet at some level, it's also intuitively obvious that these are problems that are bigger than perhaps people think about. Why do we end up, how do organizations get in that vicious cycle?
It's blindingly obvious, one of the leaders said, and no academic likes to hear that her work is blindingly obvious, but it is, as you said.
And well, but let's be clear. It doesn't mean the problem doesn't exist, and it's not rampant. So we still need smart people like you talking about it, even though people are kind of say when they read it, like, well, duh, right?
Yeah. Here's what happens. Most leaders at all levels, if you ask them, they will say, what does it take to win? They will say it takes a great team that's set up to succeed. Right? Most leaders would agree with that statement. However, many, especially in frontline service industries, think that they can't afford to create that team. So we have generated decades of leaders who were taught that labor is just another cost in production. Market pay is the right pay. Lean and mean is what drives efficiency. So a lot of leaders believe that low wages and then the resulting high turnover, poor service are just inevitable. They're just necessary to compete in their business. And what my early research shows is that actually low pay ends up hurting you a lot more than you may think. And here is a better approach. And in that approach, not only do you win with your customers, which should be the ultimate goal of any business, but you can do so while creating great value for your employees as well.
It kind of takes us to the chicken and egg question that lots of people have asked for a long time. Is it customer first or is it employee first? And while you talk about customer centricity, and we may get there, at some level, you're also saying we got to take care of the employee first so they can take care of the customer. So like that's all sort of Zenny right there, right?
And it is, when you look at companies like Costco, Four Seasons Hotels, Progressive Insurance, these are companies that have always created good jobs and won with their customers. They are customer first. They're so customer centric. But once you're customer centric, it goes by design that you have to be frontline centric because
they're the face to the customer.
They're the face, because they're the ones who are providing the service. I mean, how can you be customer centric if your employees are making such low paid wages that they can't focus on the job, that their mind is not on the job? How can you be customer centric if you are understaffed? How can you be customer centric if your employees are not empowered to make decisions for them? And by the way, if you operate with low pay and high turnover, you can't empower employees because you can't trust them to make decisions. So for these leaders, it's so obvious that once you decide to be customer centric, but like there's a difference between being customer centric and financial centric, right? This is not meaning you do everything for customers to increase sales. It's by focusing on real value for customers. Once you make that decision, then it goes by logic that you have to be frontline centric.
So Zeynep, here's the question. People are listening and they may say, oh, so she has written an HR book, but wait a minute, but she's an operations person. So what is it? Which is it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, of course, people part is really important. And I'm oftentimes asked, what is the good job strategy that you're talking about? And part of it is investment in people, higher pay, more benefits, career paths. But the secret sauce of the good job strategy is positioning your employees for success. And that is all about operations. So how do you design your jobs? How do you design your operations in a way that increases productivity of your employees and contribution of your employees so that you can invest in them? For example, I'll tie it to operations specifically. If you go to a Costco store, and most of your listeners would be familiar with Costco, you may not see a lot of products, but you will see a ton of people. More people than you would see at a typical retail store. Why? Because one of the operational choices that I have identified as part of the Good Jobs strategy is operate with slack, which means have more people than the expected workload. So you might ask, how could this be efficient, right? How could this be a good operational choice? Because when you operate your stores with enough people, more than enough people to handle all the customer traffic, now people don't make mistakes. Now the shelves are stocked. When there's a long line of customers at the checkout, they are positioned into different checkouts. So you process them as quickly as possible. That's money in the bank because you're increasing sales. When you have enough people, now they're constantly running experiments in terms of what drives sales, how can we bring down costs? And because they generate so much value for the customer because of operating with Slack, Costco can pay them well. Costco can offer better jobs. So the operational choices, and I identified 4: operate with Slack, focus and simplify, standardize and empower, and cross-train. That's the secret sauce of the Good Job strategy.
So, and I have all 4 of those ready to put across the bottom of the screen as I did with the one. So I want to talk about that, just those a little bit more. And we don't have time to go into all 4 of them because there's other things I want us to talk about. But you've already talked about this idea of empowering our folks, and yet you put that together with the idea of standardizing. So people might not think about how those 2 ideas are hooked together. So make the connection for us.
Yes, oftentimes we think about standardization as crushing dignity or top-down rules, centralization. But if done right, standardization can enable empowerment. We all have limited cognitive ability, right? We can't think about so many things all at once. So if those routine things, we call them habits sometimes, if those routine things are standardized, so you don't even have to think about them, then you can focus your mental abilities on re-solving customer problems, re-improving your processes, and really thinking about way to raise sales and cut costs elsewhere. So standardization enables empowerment. It's also a great enabler of process improvement.
And that's why these 4 things go together, because if you have a little slack, that means everyone has time to be thinking about that rather than taking care of the next fire with the next customer. So all of this is hooked together. So you identified 4 things here, and yet you also say this early in the book that this is a system, not individual choices or individual decisions. Like, hey, we're going to go cross train, right? Okay, we're going to cross-train, then we'll solve this problem. You're saying, no, it's not about individual things. It's the system. Say a little bit more about that.
Exactly. So I'll follow up with the standardization as an example, Kevin. I was running a workshop with one of the large companies, and we were discussing this case about Mercadona. And Mercadona is a Spanish supermarket chain, and they operate with very low employee turnover, reinvest in their people. And I asked the audience, how are they able to get more out of their employees? And one person said, well, they empower people to make decisions. And I said, okay, what are the benefits of empowerment? And we went through all the benefits of empowerment, right? You can increase sales, you can reduce costs, you can do all this thing. It's motivating. One participant raised his hand and he said, a few years ago, we empowered our cashiers and we lost tens of millions of dollars. Now, why is it that empowerment didn't work for them and it works for Mercadona? Mercadona can empower their people because they have low employee turnover. So their employees have been experienced and they have been there for a long time. So you can trust them to make judgment. Why can
because they have enough experience and knowledge to make those judgments.
Exactly. Why can they empower? Because focus and simplify. Mercadona doesn't operate with tens of thousands of different products and things that are changing all the time. They have fewer products and services, so employees can be knowledgeable about the products and services that they sell. They're cross-trained, so they know more about the operations than a typical person, and they operate with Slack, so they have time to make the right decision. So these are the enablers for empowerment, and you can make the same connections for any of the 4 operational choices or investment in people.
Well, and if we just say a little bit more about empowerment, and that is, to me, we can say as leaders or as an organization, through our leaders, we're going to empower people. But there's the other side of that. Like, people have to understand and be willing to accept that as well on the employee side. And if we set up the right processes, as you've described, then people understand that and are willing to sort of raise their hand and say yes to that, because just giving it to them without what goes around it, as you've said, isn't necessarily going to get us anywhere either. Except
just because
empowerment isn't something that's only given, it must be accepted, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, just because you give people decision rights, it doesn't mean that they're going to take them. Absolutely. And by the way, if you operate with high turnover, it's very difficult to empower employees, because in those settings, what you see is managers are constantly fighting fires. Managers are fighting fires because people don't show up, because people show up late, because there are customer service problems, because there are equipment problems. So there's no time to hire the right people and to train them well, right? So if you have a workforce and you haven't hired the right people, you haven't trained them well, of course, you are less likely to trust them to make decisions. And corporate's way of dealing with this is, let's remove more decision making away from the front lines. And in any service industry, actually in any setting, any complex setting, you know that if you remove all the decisions from the front lines and do everything, top down in a central manner, some of those decisions are not going to be good decisions. Right? Some of them are not going to work for the front lines, which will mean that now the front lines don't trust the organization. I'm not much of a baseball person at all, but one of the companies that we visited, and I live in Boston, this is a Red Sox nation, right? So one of the retailers here, they were carrying Yankees gear. Like, nobody is going to buy Yankees gear in Boston.
No, that's like the example used in the book of sending snowblowers to Miami. Like, oh, not a snowblower in Miami either.
But you would be surprised how frequently these decisions that appear to be so silly for the front lines are made all the time, because organizations are complex. And if you try to centralize everything, you're bound to make these bad decisions. And of course, when employees see these bad decisions, they say, corporate has no idea what they're talking about, so I'm not even going to follow their plans, right? So I'm not. And then of course they don't follow, and then there's a really terrible distrust loop that happens between the front lines and the headquarters.
100%. I couldn't have said it better. I've worked in hundreds of organizations, and you hear it. Even you hear some of it even in the very best organizations. But when we're nowhere close to what we're describing here, it is, as you said, a distrust loop. We've talked about several now sort of vicious cycles, and you talk about trying to turn them into virtuous cycles. And we can't go into that in great depth, but talk about that a little bit, about the idea, like we have to get the switch flipped so we can start to go up instead of spin downward. Give us a little bit of a thought about that.
Yeah, and for us to flip the switch. So if your listeners are working in organizations that are in this vicious cycle and so many things are going wrong, there is not one or two things that they would have to do. That there are so many different things that they would have to do, and it's a system, a good job system that needs to be implemented. And for the switch to be turned on, there needs to be some urgency around this issue, and the urgency has to be, we have to change in order to survive or grow our business or win with our customers. Without a business urgency and a big business need, that switch will never turn on. So that's the number one thing to do. The number two thing to do is to recognize that the work that frontlines do is largely driven by people in the home office. They might be in product design, they might be in supply chain, they might be in logistics, they might be in marketing, there might be in sales and finance, who have nothing to do with managing the frontline employees, but they drive the work that frontline employees do. So these leaders in the home office need to be aligned in the need to change, and they need to start making decisions differently. I'll give you an example.
Before you go there, let me just make another point to what you're saying, and that is that not only are the people in supply chain and manufacturing and production and product and all that stuff at the home office in the ivory tower doing work, as you said, that drives the work of the front line. Making that even worse, they don't even think about their jobs in that way. They're doing their stuff. They're not even thinking about the impact that's having on the front line. So that's just an added challenge to what you're describing.
Exactly. I mean, one company we work with, for example, one of the biggest problems in the front lines was that workers had very unstable schedules. Their hours were changing from week to week. And imagine having a job where you don't know when you're going to work, right?
Until Thursday for Monday.
Exactly. And it will be, I mean, it's terrible. But one of the biggest drivers of this was merchandising. So somebody in merchandising will change their mind in the last minute. They will say, you know what, we were going to run this promotion of 2 for 1 or whatever the promotion is on a Tuesday. We'll run it on a Monday. And for them, like, there's no difference. It's just one day. But now that 50 hours of work that needs to be done on a Tuesday needs to be done on a Monday. That means that so many people's schedules have to change in the last minute. But the person,
but they have to change less if we have Slack. If we're operating with Slack, we have more opportunity to accommodate some of that.
Except that if there's too much variability, operating with Slack will be very expensive, very, very expensive. So one of the first things we do when we work with organizations is to say, if you need to change, think about what are some of the things that you're asking your front lines to do that you can remove. What are the tedious tasks? What are the non-value added activities? Just look at all the work that people do and see what can you take out. And then the other thing is, how can you smooth out the work in the front lines, right? Because sometimes also from the corporate, because many large organizations work in silos. So on Monday and Tuesday, there's so much work. And on Wednesday, Thursday, there's not enough. And then when the workload goes up and down, it's very difficult, again, to create consistency and stability in schedules. But if there was somebody in the home office that was coordinating all this, life would be so much better for the front lines, and they would serve the customer better. At the end, coming back to like what matters so much, if you want to serve your customer, you need people who are experienced, who know what they're doing, who can focus on the job. And this is a way for companies to be able to win with their customers.
So Zeynep, you mentioned something a minute ago that says no organization is going to make the kinds of changes we're talking about, even if they intellectually agree with what we're talking about, unless there's a sense of urgency, unless there's something that happens. And so we all experienced something that created a whole lot of change a couple of years ago called a pandemic. So my question is, in your work, what have you found? Like, how has the pandemic changed how some organizations have thought about this? Did it prompt some organizations to make the kinds of changes you're suggesting? I'm just curious because we have this very sort of recent thing that could have been a stimulus. I'm curious your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, the pandemic had so many different effects, obviously, but one of the effects since the pandemic, and this had happened before the pandemic, is quit rates in the United States had been increasing before the pandemic. Just last year, it hit to 50 million people quit their jobs. And that is increasing urgency around, we need to attract the right people, we need to retain them, we need to pay attention to the jobs that we offer. So that has been one thing. There was a period where we recognized essential workers. We recognize that essential workers, those who are working, taking care of our elderly, those who are producing the food and selling the food that we need, those who are working in retail stores, we recognize that they are essential to the functioning of our economy. Sadly, that mentality went away shortly after the pandemic. We are back to like, okay, these are low-wage jobs. These are not great jobs. So I think the pandemic brought that out in terms of the need to attract and retain people. And that trend is going to continue, right? That trend is going to continue because baby boomers are retiring. people aren't having as many kids as before. So there will be a tight labor market for a long time. And if companies don't change their system, they're going to find that their labor costs will rise, but their turnover will stay the same because the job is the same job. Productivity will stay the same. The job is the same job. But if they adopt this good job system, then the higher people investment is really not an investment.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking now about turnover. We're talking about trying, if we use the kinds of ideas you're talking about here, the good job strategy, we'll have higher retention, less turnover. And I find in our work that organizations always talk about how expensive turnover is, but to your point, not enough to want to change anything significantly, right? To your point, which I think which is why what you're sharing is so very important.
And I will say, Kevin, that the urgency that I have seen among the companies that change came more from a competitive point of view. The urgency was, we are behind our competitors. We're losing our customers. For us to survive, we have to be customer centric. And that urgency, for example, Sam's Club is one of the examples that I provide in the book, or Mudbay. Mudbay is a smallish retailer, pet retailer, and they realized that e-commerce was taking sales away from them. And in this omni-channel e-commerce type of world, they thought the only way we can survive is if we provide a compelling reason for our customers to shop at our stores. Right. And they said, what are we going to do? We're going to have knowledgeable people who can prescribe merchandise for dog owners, dogs and cats. Right. Well, for us to have this consultative workforce, they need to be an experienced workforce who know what they're doing. So we have to reduce our turnover. How do we reduce our turnover? By implementing the system. But it was, again, the business need came from the customers and the need to compete versus, we need to provide good jobs.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. Like, while everyone, as I said at the very beginning, will raise their hand, do we want to have good jobs? Sure, we want one, but we're not necessarily thinking about that for our organization. It's got to come from as the outcome of another problem. We've got a question that came in from LinkedIn. I want to share it with you real quick, and then you can talk to it for a second. Then we'll go into the final sort of section of our conversation. The question comes in and says, "Operation with Slack is a good idea, but to manage it is very hard. High costs, more conflict, more supervision, and so on. I'm not sure if this concept will outweigh the side effects." Do you want to comment to that briefly?
Yeah. So let me share.
Because you've heard that before.
Yes, I've heard this before. And let me talk about the cost of not operating with Slack first. What are the costs of not operating with Slack? Well, for workers, the cost of burnout. Right? Burnout, we're hearing that word all the time, burnout. But there is more. The cost is operational mistakes because people don't have enough time to do their jobs. The cost is lost sales. The cost is lower productivity. The cost is you're not able to hire the right person and train them well because you have no time. The cost is leaders have no time to lead their firefighting. So the cost of not operating with Slack is really high. And in my field of operations, if anyone has ever taken an operations class, you will learn that in any system with variability, operating with Slack is the optimal choice. You always want to have a little bit more because you need to be able to deal with variability. Now, the problem becomes if you have a system that has just too much variability, because you lack discipline, because you haven't hired the right people, because you're not paying them well, first reduce that variability, right? The first job, because I agree with with the question now, if you have too much variability in your system, operating with Slack becomes very expensive. So first reduce that variability, first reduce workload as much as possible, first improve your turnover so you have hired the right people, you have trained them well, you have a stable workforce, then think about operating with Slack.
I love that. So I told you before we went live that I would never get to all of the questions that I had for you. And that's true. My guests came true. You and I could have a long conversation, and I know that it would be useful, and I know what people expect from us in terms of time. So I'll ask this. Is there something I didn't ask that you wish I would have? Or said a different way, is there one more thing that you'd like people to leave with?
Sometimes system change sounds risky and daunting for people when they learn about the good job strategy. But during the last couple of years, I had the opportunity to see system change from an organization, a $60 billion retailer, to 2 units of a small restaurant. And it's not as risky if you make the right choices first, if you start in the right way. And I will say the result is not just winning with your customers and having an amazing company, but it's so meaningful for the leaders who have been able to make this change, because they end up changing the lives of their employees. At Sam's Club, when they announced their first wage increases, they raised wages $5 to $7 an hour from a basis of $15 an hour. And when that announcement went out in the stores, some people cried, right? Some people said, I need to call my wife because I don't have to work 2 jobs anymore. This is incredibly meaningful for leaders to be able to make this much of an impact. And every workshop after workshop that we run with companies, I see how energized people are when they hear about this and how much they want to do this. And that gives me so much hope that we can have a much better functioning companies and a better society if more companies adopted this approach that so many people want.
I love that. That's why I was looking forward to having you on. And this has been fantastic. But I have a few more things to ask you before we go, including sort of shifting out of operations and good jobs and all that stuff and talk about you. I want to know what you do for fun.
I have 4 kids, and we always have people over for dinner every week, probably multiple times a week. And that's always fun. We play poker. Those are some of the fun activities that I do. And I love going for walks and exercising too.
And the only thing you knew I was going to ask you is this. So what are you reading? What do you want to share with us?
Yes, I just finished Poverty by America by Matthew Desmond. It's a fantastic book. And now I just started reading Best Team Ever by David Burkus, and I'm looking forward to it.
Best Team Ever by David Burkus. David's a friend of mine, and he will be on this podcast. I think we've now scheduled it. It'll be sometime after you're hearing this. And
I'll tell him I said that.
I will do that. I will do that. Perfect. So the question you want me to ask, though, is this: where can we learn more about your work? Where can we get the book? Where do you want to point people at this point?
So my book, The Case for Good Jobs, is available tomorrow. It's coming out tomorrow, so I'm very excited. You can see it at any bookstore. But you can find out about my nonprofit, goodjobsinstitute.org. We have a lot of information about the Good Job strategy. We have videos, we have free resources. So that's probably the best place to learn more about this work.
Say that one more time.
Goodjobsinstitute.org.
Goodjobsinstitute.org, everyone. And now the question I have for all of you who are watching and listening is, now what? If you didn't get something in the last 30 minutes that you can go apply, listen again, because there was plenty we talked about, things to think about, things to consider. And even, one of the things that I wrote down is this connection. I knew it, but you said it in such an eloquent way. The connection between standardizing as thinking about it as a habit, which allows us and frees us up, rather than it being something that is restrictive. And I think that when we think about it in that way, it can be a very powerful thing. I think there's plenty of other things that you might have individually taken from this. I hope that you will think back on what you got, and along with choosing to order a copy of this book, The Case for Good Jobs, you will take action on the ideas that you thought of during the course of this conversation. So, Zeynep, thank you so much for being here. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for having me, Kevin.
Everybody, this was awesome, but you know that we're back next week with another remarkable episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. I hope you'll join us then. Until then, make sure that you like, subscribe, tell your friends. You know what to do if you like this podcast. Do that wherever you happen to be listening to it, and we'll see you next week.